Lately, video games seem to release more and more content, and at first, this seems to be their way of keeping a game relevant. But as time goes on, the quality of these additions decreases dramatically. Here's why. You may have noticed that these days, new games are few and far between, unless of course you're talking about the annual releases of Call of Duty. But otherwise, game developers have really slowed down on the new releases. Now in the past, video games would keep things fresh by doing just this, coming out with new versions and new games every year. For example, GTA had 15 new releases between 1997 and 2013. Now even though some of these were lesser known, such as GTA Chinatown Wars, made for the Nintendo DS and PSP, that's still just under one release per year, every year for 16 years. Insane. With of course GTA 5 being the most successful. This was due to the online aspect, and how instead of making a new game every 2 years, they simply grew GTA 5 into something that is relevant even today. This was accomplished by adding new content regularly to the game. Instead of doing an annual release of a new game, they instead opted for an annual release of new content. In addition to GTA 5, another example is Rainbow Six Siege, which had 19 releases between 1998 and 2015. Initially, these releases were rough. Once again, the strategies were to add new content that players could work towards while also providing easier means of getting there by offering things like in-game currency, season passes, boosters, all which allowed instant or quicker access to the new additions to the game. These strategies allowed game developers a way to further develop their game, all while maintaining some. Now to be honest, I personally don't mind this, as the more a game is developed, the more polished it becomes, which in turn improves the overall experience for the players. Even though this improved the long-term life of a game, it also ironically destroys it, due to the fact that this often leads to games introducing microtransactions, loot boxes, battle passes, and other money-making methods necessarily beneficial to the players. However, that topic is for another time. Now, I do plan to explain why I think the longevity of a game can ultimately be ruined by the constant addition of new content. But before that, I would like to at the very least mention the positives, because there are quite a few. Otherwise, we would still see success in games that have annual releases. So first, let's look at a few games that have consistently added new content and retained a high player base. My favorite example of this has got to be Terraria, because almost every time I see Terraria get a major content update, I either hop on by myself or with friends to see what's new. But I must admit, Terraria is a bit of an ideal scenario, as all their updates are free. Oftentimes, video game companies will ask for a small fee for extra DLC, which is fine, or they may add content that encourages players to spend money due to long and tedious grind or gameplay elements. Anyways, my point is that I spent under $10 on Terraria, and as far exceeded my expectations. And if Rewatch hadn't decided to continue development, I might not have kept playing 10 years after the release date. As I said, Terraria is a bit of an exception, as the developers have never seemed to gain any sort of financing from adding new content. However, continuing to make money off a video game after its initial release is not necessarily bad, as long as the way in which it's accomplished is of high effort. This is where we begin to see the problem of adding an influx of new content to games. Thankfully, not every game becomes a victim to this trap. Some games that come to mind include Frostpunk, which after release pushed out a DLC that added interesting scenarios which challenged the player in new ways not seen before in the base game. This was done through adding new mechanics and challenges that related to the game, but also stood on their own very well. All the games included in the Dark Souls series had paid DLC that added new enemies, bosses, and unique areas that tortured players in never before seen ways. Although there are many great other examples, this idea is that if something does not add value to the game through the innovation of an existing mechanic and a completely new one, then it may not need to be there. On another note, there must be a finite amount of improvements, as if you keep adding more of the same thing, well, you're not really adding anything of value to the game at all. This finally brings to my biggest issue with video games being developed after their initial debut. Adding new content for the sake of adding new content. And what tends to happen is a high quality game will suffer from lazy and low effort additions as time goes on. Examples of this are in-game cosmetics and uninspired characters or map changes that happen just to happen. This is especially true for games that choose the route where they have a scheduled new character or new balance change every couple of weeks. I must admit, initially, this idea of adding new content every month sounds good on paper. I mean, who doesn't want to keep the game fresh and relevant? However, when this happens, the game over time becomes saturated with more and more additions, which can leave more casual players in the dust. Bringing up some examples from before, Rainbow Six Siege has seemed to suffer from this exact phenomenon. As more and more characters are added, the harder it is for more casual players to keep up with all the different abilities and map changes that occur. This is exaggerated the bigger your library of games is, as playing multiple games really cuts down on the time allowed to learn every caveat of every update. Not only does this make it a lot more difficult for existing players to stay with the game, but it also makes the learning curve that much steeper. As the game gets older, this pileup of new additions begins to make the game's initial release less and less relevant. As more stuff is added, the more complex the entire game becomes. Although I have hounded on mostly FPSs, MOBAs tend to be the biggest offenders when it comes to the oversaturation of content. League of Legends today has over 140 different champions to choose from. That is a lot to learn. This is also true for Dota 2 and Smite. I mean, who has the time to learn all that? In addition to a steep learning curve, the additional content tends to leave the older content out to dry. This is most likely attributed to how the game is no longer considered as a whole. Only the new content, the profitable content, is really pushed onto the players. Because of this, new game additions that just came out will usually outshine the current game elements. With so much focus on what's new, the old stuff never gets any love, and oftentimes simply exists in the background, eventually becoming obsolete. Now, I'm not saying that games should quit adding new content, but every so often the old content needs some love. If it is just left out to fend for itself against the new and improved stuff, it, as said before, will kind of fall off. One of my favorite games that seem to manage this issue very well is Don't Starve. Specifically, Don't Starve Together. This game started out by adding new characters and content like all the other popular games are doing today. But as the game compounded more and more content, some characters became clunky, hard to use, and their design didn't really make sense due to the direction the game was going. Clay, however, noticed this and decided that instead of just adding more and more stuff, their older creations needed some love. And so they creatively innovated their current character roster, specifically characters who were underwhelming or just straight up outshined. This is what I think is a solution to this influx of meaningless additional content to video games.